the U.S. is on board with gold being moved back into the system as a neutral reserve asset, fully on board. And sort of, I think it would be bullish for gold. I don't know that we'd wake up and gold would be up, $1,000 or something, but I think it would be very bullish for gold over the ensuing however many, over the coming quarters and years. As it relates to China vis-a-vis gold, it's kind of a two sides of the same coin type of question, because I do believe there are interests in the U.S. government and intelligence world that see that if gold prices went much higher as part of a reset of a system where gold is the neutral reserve asset, that it might benefit the Chinese and the Russians to the detriment of others, particularly given in-ground reserves. If the Chinese and the Russians have more in-ground reserves of the neutral reserve asset, then that is an advantage, relative to what they may have in vaults. And I think there's some validity to that objection. I think for gold, I think it's a trade where all roads lead to gold. Like pretty much anything that can happen, I think is good for gold. And I think ultimately it's good for Bitcoin, but Bitcoin still trades with a risk-off component to it, as people have talked about, vis-a-vis NASDAQ and what have you, stocks more broadly. But gold seems to be kind of a winner no matter what happens. Rates go up, we get a fiscal crisis, which may be partly contributing to the breakout today. Good for gold. Rates go down aggressively, real rates go negative, good for gold. We get a trade deal, or we don't get a trade deal. We saw that with Liberation Day, good for gold. We get war, good for gold. We get peace. Increasingly, it looks like the peace is going to be dictated, at least in part, by the BRICS. That's probably good for gold, any peace dictated by BRICS rather than by the U.S. And so you kind of look around and just go, all roads lead to gold. That makes sense to me. From a Bitcoin standpoint, I think it's kind of the same thing. Like I said, Bitcoin does have a bit more of a drag with what risk assets are doing in the short run. But ultimately, I think the reason why both have done so well year to date is neutral reserve assets. All of a sudden, long-term sovereign bonds are no longer risk-free on a real basis. And that's something that is, the math has been crystal clear for 10 plus years. But I think just in recent years, and then overlaying the geopolitics on top of that post 2022 with the Russian FX reserve sanctions, all of a sudden people are thinking about, and maybe even layering in the nationalization and Trump and tariffs and stuff, like, do I actually hold what I own? And is it actually inflation proof? And, there's really only two assets, in my view, that do a really good job of that as a neutral reserve asset: Energy Link, supportable, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's gold and Bitcoin. And so it makes sense to me that those two are leading, or, top of the leaderboard year to date.
Alongside gold, Bitcoin has emerged as a modern counterpart. While it still reacts to risk sentiment, especially in correlation with tech stocks, its long-term appeal is strengthening. Bitcoin's limited supply and decentralized nature position it as digital gold. Institutional adoption has accelerated, with major ETFs now providing broader access for investors worldwide. Still, Bitcoin remains more volatile than gold, acting as both a speculative asset and a potential reserve. Together, gold and Bitcoin form a dual hedge against inflation, devaluation, and geopolitical shocks, bridging the old world of tangible wealth and the digital age of decentralized money.
I think we're in two pitches into the first inning to what is a probably once in 100-year monetary system change. And I think it's gonna impact sort of everything around us. There was I don't know if it was a hot mic or intended to be heard, but Putin and Xi in early 23, as Xi was leaving Moscow, said, look, we're making changes to the system not seen in 100 years, and we're driving these changes. And to me, I thought that was a really important comment, because 100 years prior was 1922, roughly, which was the Genoa Conference of 1922, which historians and macro people far greater than me point to as arguably the original sin to sort of this present dollar system, which that was when it was decided that gold, that the dollar and the British pound would be made on par with gold as an FX reserve. And that basically made the dollar and pound as good as gold and everything else less. And that kind of kicked off this whole dynamic of, paper is as good as gold.
For decades, sovereign bonds were considered risk-free, but rising deficits and inflation have eroded that trust. U.S. Treasury debt, once the world's cornerstone safe asset, is no longer guaranteed to preserve real value. This shift has profound implications. Investors and governments alike are reconsidering where to store wealth that cannot be devalued through inflation or frozen by sanctions. The freezing of Russian reserves in 2022 shocked the global financial system, prompting countries to rethink reliance on Western-controlled assets. The conclusion for many has been simple. Neutral assets like gold and increasingly Bitcoin offer safer long-term alternatives.
And as soon as you do that, where you don't have to settle imbalances in gold, in physical specie, those imbalances are allowed to grow and grow and grow, and there's a winner and there's a loser, and there's political reasons that those choices were made. And I think part of it was allowed to continue post-World War II because, the choice was pretty simple. Like, the world was trashed except for the U.S. And so the U.S. had all this industry and no customers, and the rest of the world had nothing, of certainly the industrialized world. And the choice was like, okay, either we live hand to mouth for the next 60 years, or we basically create a system for a period of time where debt becomes an asset, and in a very widespread manner, as a way to basically pull forward from the future, rebuild the centuries of capital that was destroyed from 1914 through 1945 in two world wars. And politically, there was really no choice, right? Once people start to starve and live hand to mouth, they're going to vote for really bad people again, and you're just going to go right back to where you started from. So the decision was made at a very high level to basically have this system as we had out of World War II, which was, the dollar at the center of it, dollar pegged to gold, everything else around the dollar. And that was done for very realpolitik reasons, which was just like the choice is everybody lives in caves and rebuilds hand to mouth basically after World War II. And we rebuild over 60 years and everyone's quality of standard of living sucks for 60 years. And we have another depression for another 60 years. Or we can rebuild really aggressively by sort of, stockpiling debt as reserve assets. And that's the choice that was understandably made.
History shows monetary systems rarely last forever. The current dollar-dominated framework traces back to the Genoa Conference of 1922, where paper currencies began to be treated as good as gold. Later, after World War II, Bretton Woods cemented the dollar's central role. But every system carries flaws, and imbalances have now reached breaking points. China and Russia openly call for alternatives, while BRICS nations push for settlement mechanisms beyond the dollar. As Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin remarked in 2023, the world is entering changes not seen in a century. The global financial order is being rewritten.
The part that I feel like most, even senior market participants, many don't recognize is A, that this was a decision that was understood and made, and B, that there was a follow-on to that, which was it was always understood that at some point they were going to have to go back to a neutral reserve asset, a gold, presumably, type of system, or a Bancor type of neutral reserve asset, as Keynes talked about it at Bretton Woods. So, it's one of these huge changes where I think we are now in sort of two pitches into the first inning of going back. We have now reached the point, we can see it in the debt, we can see it in the deficits, we can see it in the geopolitics, we can see it in the imbalances that are just so far beyond anything anyone ever imagined or intended. We've got to go back to what they always knew they were going to have to go back to, which was a neutral reserve asset that settles trade and that floats in all currencies. And so I think we're in very early stage of that. I think there is some disagreement around that. I think much of the global South wants gold. I think the United States has started to stand up Bitcoin essentially through the stablecoin initiatives in particular to perhaps compete with this or offer an alternative. We'll see. But to me, the imbalances are so massive and it's so early on. I don't think people have, as this 100-year original error and then understandable political decision post World War II was made and needs to now be unwound, exactly what that implies for, the international trade value of the dollar, for the price of gold, the price of Bitcoin, different asset classes, for what happens to the real value of bonds. There's just so many things it potentially impacts.
China sits at the heart of this shift. For decades, Beijing has encouraged its citizens to buy gold, building household and state reserves alike. Today, this strategy aligns perfectly with its broader economic goals, strengthening domestic consumption, weakening dollar dependence, and reinforcing the yuan's role. A higher gold price would recapitalize Chinese households, giving them more purchasing power. At the same time, it pressures U.S. policymakers who face a dilemma: resist gold's rise or accept it as part of a reset. Meanwhile, Russia and China's vast in-ground reserves complicate the balance, making gold both a tool and a weapon.
Well, I think if the U.S., they'll take the shorter one first. I think if the U.S. did revalue it just with the accounting move, I think it would signal that the U.S. is on board with gold being moved back into the system as a neutral reserve asset, fully on board. And sort of, I think it would be bullish for gold. I don't know that we'd wake up and gold would be up, $1,000 or something. But I think it would be very bullish for gold over the ensuing, however many, over the coming quarters and years. As it relates to China vis-a-vis gold, it's kind of a two sides of the same coin type of question, because I do believe there are interests in the U.S. government and intelligence world that see that if gold prices went much higher as part of a reset of a system where gold is the neutral reserve asset, that it might benefit the Chinese and the Russians to the detriment of others, particularly given in-ground reserves. If the Chinese and the Russians have more in-ground reserves of the neutral reserve asset, then that is an advantage, relative to what they may have in vaults. And I think there's some validity to that objection.
The world is only at the beginning of this transformation. The debt burdens, deficits, and geopolitical rivalries are too large to ignore. A return to a neutral reserve asset, whether gold, Bitcoin, or a hybrid, appears inevitable. For investors, this signals an era of opportunity, but also volatility. Gold may not explode overnight, but its steady climb reflects growing recognition of its central role. Bitcoin, while less stable, continues to gain legitimacy as a parallel hedge. Together, they embody the transition into a new century of money, one where trust is earned not by governments, but by scarcity and resilience.
The flip side to it is the U.S. spends most of its interactions with China telling the Chinese they need to consume more of their own production. And the Chinese government has been, paradoxically, the communists have been telling their people for 25 years to buy more gold, buy gold, buy gold, buy gold, buy gold, buy gold, which is a very non-authoritarian, decentralized, freedom-loving thing to do, which is why I say it's paradoxical. And so point being is that I think the grand bargain to be had on the table is, look, the U.S. needs to weaken the dollar. The U.S. wants the yuan stronger against the dollar. And the U.S. wants China to consume more of their own production. And as you go down that list of three, the price of gold's a lot higher. It's like check, check, check. It takes care of all three. You can recap Chinese consumer balance sheets. They will have a lot more money to spend on their own production if the price of gold goes up a lot. You will have a weaker dollar, and I forget what the third one I just said was, but the gist of it is that the price of gold going up a lot helps all three of those things. So there's sort of two sides of the house. I think from a grand deal to be had within sort of a reset, I think it is in the U.S.'s interest for the price of gold sitting in China to go up a lot. But it's not in the U.S.'s interest, arguably, for the price of gold in the ground in China and in Russia to go up a lot. So, it's kind of one of these. The U.S. needs to decide what it wants, because ultimately China's happy to keep buying gold here because they know relative to U.S. debt, it's still wildly undervalued. So they'll happily just keep piling it on regardless.